Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Stella Smith, and I'd like to welcome you to the MACH-III Center Masterclass, Racial Battle Fatigue. I'd like to welcome Dr. Fred Bonner to give our opening remarks, and then we'll get into our panel discussion. Dr. Bonner?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, Dr. Smith. And greeting everyone out there in our virtual land. Thank you so much for joining us in this installation of Masterclass, a town hall forum on racial battle fatigue. And we're so excited that you're joining us tonight. We have not only a cast of characters, but a cast of scholars who are poised and ready to talk to us and lead us in a discussion about the implications of racial battle fatigue, equity, social justice, issues that impact them as they traverse these campuses, and really impact what we're doing by way of diversity, equity, and inclusion across the board. But to highlight, to serve as the organizing center for tonight's conversation is Dr. Nicholas Hartlip's book, Racial Battle Fatigue in Faculty, looking at their experiences in higher education. And this conversation is going to be led by Dr. Hartlip and Dr. William Smith, who's actually the architect and the diviner of this wonderful theoretical framework, racial battle fatigue, that we have all used and have used effectively to meet the needs of our students in these predominantly white and historically Black and marginalized contexts. So without further ado, we'll get moving, get started to initiate tonight's conversation, to hear from these scholars about their experiences at the intersections of who they are as scholars, as academics, and how they experience racial battle fatigue in their various contexts.
Thank you, Dr. Bonner. So just a couple of notes about the run of show for the program. We're going to start with the conversation with Dr. Smith and Dr. Hartlip. Then we're going to open it up to our panel for an open discussion about racial battle fatigue in faculty in various contexts. One other thing, I am not Jamal Watson or Dr. Watson. He was supposed to be with us tonight to moderate. Unfortunately, he's not able to be with us. And so I am moderating tonight's discussion in his stead. And we sent him good thoughts. So without further ado, I'm going to transition into the conversation with Dr. William Smith and Dr. Nicholas Hartlip. So one question, and maybe it's a question that everyone is thinking right now, what actually is racial battle fatigue? Provide us with your overview and definition of that, Dr. Smith and Dr. Hartlip. Maybe Dr. Smith, you go first.
Okay, let me give you the technical term. So racial battle fatigue is a psychological, emotional, physiological overload. So it's that stress appraisal. It's a race-related stress appraisal that our system is being overtaxed. It's exceeding our coping strategies, and it's putting us in an endangered position where our well-being is in jeopardy. And our well-being being our health. So another way of looking at this is a disturbed person racial or racist relationship, a disturbed person environmental racist relationship. Now, for those people who are not academics, just people in the grassroots, you might think about Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. And they had a song featuring Melly Mel, and it was called The Message. And it said, "Don't push me, because I'm close to the edge. I'm trying not to lose my head. It's like a jungle out there. Sometimes it makes me wonder how I keep from going under." That's racial battle fatigue.
Wow, that imagery is powerful. So, Dr. Hartlip, what are your thoughts about racial battle fatigue, and why did you choose this as the subject of this text?
So I had written about my own testimonials, personal narratives around experiencing racial battle fatigue. drawing on Dr. Smith's work. And when I saw the call for book proposals in Dr. Bonner's series, I immediately was interested in doing a book on Asian Americans and racial battle fatigue. But the press, Routledge, wanted something topical, but that went across different ethnic, cultural, racial groups. And so that's why in the text you'll see a volume that looks at Indigenous scholars, women scholars, Asian American scholars, Black scholars, Latinx scholars. Added area, though, that we wanted to explore in the book was to look at the experiences of these faculty members in their respective institution type. And so largely, if you read the literature, you see a lot of writing in primarily white or historically white institutions. But I was interested also in hearing the narratives and experiences of folks in minority serving institutions, in tribal colleges. And so that's the added nuance this volume looks at, is the experiences of different marginalized populations and their experience in the actual institution type. And so it might be a teaching intensive institution, or it might be a research focus. The last thing, based on what your question was, is that to me, in a very simple way, just the term itself, it is the fatigue from constantly having to battle racism, and it can lead to, premature death and all of the symptoms and the mental and the physical anguish. And so that's my take on it. It's a very useful theoretical frame to use.
Thank you, Dr. Hartleb. Dr. Smith, are you surprised by how frequently the term has been used since you coined it in 2008, and how the research and literature has grown since that time using racial battle fatigue as a theoretical framework?
Well, thank you for the question. I actually coined that in 2003. And I can say yes and no. And the reason why I would say no is because I worked very closely with Dr. Chester Pierce. Dr. Pierce was my mentor. I would lean on him heavily to make sure I was going in the right direction. And he really was backing me to get this out, because he felt like I was extending his work on racial microaggressions. And so we would meet. The last time we met was at a restaurant in Boston that he liked to go to because Malcolm X was supposed to have been a waiter there. And so if anybody knows what that restaurant is, or please let me know, because I've forgotten. I wanted to record that as a counter story. But it took over 20 years before Dr. Pierce's racial microaggression work got out, especially into education. So I wasn't really surprised. It took a little while, but now it's crossed a lot of disciplines. It's in law, it's in sociology, it's in education, it's in social work. And so it just makes sense. As Dr. Hartleb said, when I went home to Chicago, you back in the Black community, and they feel so good about you being successful, quote unquote, right? And so I went through a car wash. I was waiting for my car to come out, and some old Black men were sitting there, and they said, "Hey, you Smitty, ain't you?" I said, "Yes, sir." They said, "Yeah, you doing great things up in that college. I heard about you. What's that research you do?" And they didn't know about the term, but I said racial battle fatigue. They said, "Oh yeah, I got some of that." And they went on and described it clearly. So I knew that I had something that was really clear enough that represented the pain and struggle of particularly Black people, Black women and men at the time, but racialized people altogether. And the thing about it is, when you can name your pain, then you can start to develop solutions to be resilient. And before, we were working in isolation, suffering as Black faculty in these institutions, thinking it was us instead of a system.
Wow, that's powerful. Powerful, powerful. So Dr. Hartlib, for the text that you wrote, what would you want? What is the main takeaway that you'd like people to take from reading the text and learning about racial battle fatigue across the various contexts that were included in that work?
Well, as a critical race theorist, Trump has been waging war on CRT. I would say that because racism is ordinary and happens all across spaces and time, that racial battle fatigue is an important topic to explore at all institution types. Also, I guess the focus for me was personal as well as professional. The book, we didn't know the themes that would emerge, but if you read the book, many of the themes were related to hiring practices and experiences as faculty on the tenure line and or in the precariat if they're adjuncts. So the focus really, who should read the book? Everyone, but in particular, hiring authorities, department chairs, deans, associate deans, presidents, because I'm really wanting this book to get into the hands of people who are responsible for protecting and making sure that the experiences that their faculty have are healthy. And so there are counter stories about folks who have been hired in diversity fellowship positions with the understanding that it might lead to a full-time job when actually what happens is, no, it doesn't. It's a dead end, and all of their labor is stolen from them. Experiences of women being sexually harassed. And so, the Me Too movement still is going on. It's just perhaps losing steam in the media because of the pandemic and other topics. But those are some of the themes that are still always very valuable. And ultimately, I want leaders to have to read those narratives.
Thank you, Dr. Hartlib. So Dr. Smith, someone sent us a message. Tiana Rogers said that Malcolm X worked at Small's Paradise. So you ask the internet and the social media and you get. So thank you so much for responding. So Dr. Hartlib, your comments lead directly into this next question about, in what ways is racial battle fatigue a public health and a mental health illness? And how might it be exacerbated with these dual pandemics of COVID-19 and the systematic racism that's now been revealed? It was there, but now that people are actually seeing it. So how is racial battle fatigue kind of complicated, or those people that are experiencing it in this time, basically? And Dr. Smith, Dr. Hartlib, whomever wants to go first.
Did you want to go, Nick?
I was going to yield to my elder.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I think we have to look at it this way. In 1951, William Patterson approached the UN in Paris with a charge against a crime against the United States government. It was called We Charge Genocide, crimes against the Negro people in the United States. He had co-petitioners in that petition, in that report, of the likes of W.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, and many others. I think over 40 people signed that as co-petitioners. And one of the definitions of genocide is not the total annihilation of a people by race, ethnicity, religion, but the mental and physical harm, the deliberate mental and physical harm to a group. This is very consistent with what has happened to Black people in particular, but racialized people all over the globe under white supremacy. So I don't really use the term people of color. I use targets, racialized targets of white supremacy or racialized people, because we have to describe what is being, what's happening to these groups. And it is a process of genocide. So there's a physiological, a psychological, and an emotional behavioral kind of response to what we're dealing with under racial battle fatigue. Some of the psychological responses are being frustrated, being defensive, irritable, having sudden changes in your mood, becoming angry, being in shock, disappointment, ruminating. I do that too often. You know, you have to really look at how you ruminate over these issues or feel hopeless or helpless. So that's just a psychological damage. The emotional and behavioral are things like stereotype threat, John Henryism or Jane Henryism, overeating, lack of eating, being impatient, increased use of alcohol or drugs, smoking. Some of the physiological responses would be things like prolonged headaches, grinding of your teeth, shortness of breath, rapid heart breathing, sleep disturbance. I'm unfortunately dealing with a bout of insomnia right now. And part of it is because I have my major things off of my plate that I thought were stress related. The Racial Crisis in American Higher Education, Volume 3 is in press. My chapter, putting racial battle fatigue as a psychosocial antecedent, talking about anti-Black misandry, anti-Black misogyny, how LGBT members are part of this equation of racial battle fatigue, how disability, people with disabilities are part of this racial battle fatigue understanding. So I thought I was home free, but yet I'm still struggling. So we have to take inventory of how our body and our minds are working based upon what we're dealing with. And sometimes we have a misfocus. We think it's one thing and it's something else. One thing that Black people do not do, and I would say by extension, people who are racialized, minoritized folks, we do not do is play the race card. We usually look at ourselves and say, what am I doing wrong? Why can't I be better? How can I get this together? And we don't look at the system. And so what we have to realize today is that with the weight of this pandemic, if Dr. Ford was here, she would call it a pandemic of racism, a pandemic of this virus, and a pandemic of economic class, right? So those three pandemics are disproportionately impacting racialized targets of white supremacy. So what I just read off to you about these responses sounds a lot like pre-existing conditions, right? So said differently, if white supremacy was a sniper, racism is the sniper's rifle. COVID-19 is the bullet. And if you are lucky enough to make it to a healthcare provider, a medical specialist, and then you wake up and look and you find out that he or she is the sniper, that's racial battle fatigue under white supremacy.
The one thing that Dr. Smith mentioned, and I've written about in my own experience, has been paranoia. As a young scholar, as a cisgendered heterosexual, I appeared normative in the sense of white supremacy because anti-Blackness, I benefit from anti-Blackness because I'm a model minority. Well, in my experiences, I was wondering, if I'm a model minority, why am I experiencing these things? I remember I've written about an experience when a white faculty member, elder, and the older senior colleague was mentioning, that I was violating the copyright copy machine rules, like so surveillance. And then that leads to, always looking over your shoulder, like, am I doing something wrong? Being overlooked for leadership opportunities. And almost the reverse, I was thinking, well, is there a term for the reverse of ageism? What do you call that when young people get discriminated against? And, it's adultism. So, even though I'm married and I have 3 kids, as a young young scholar of color, I've had those experiences, and it does cause you to be paranoid all the time. Am I doing this right? Am I not? And in my experience, I've left different institutions, not because you know, I wasn't willing to stay, but because I knew I would never get opportunities to lead. You know, as a young department chair, I've had to go to 2 other institutions to get those opportunities. And so I just echo everything Dr. Smith said. And the one case that I've written about is paranoia.
Yeah. I will, can I just add this? One of the things about Asian American faculty, students, staff is not recognizing oftentimes when coping strategies should be employed because they are oftentimes considered not having a problem or dealing with an issue. So even therapists underdiagnose some of their conditions, things like depression. Oh, you're model minority, so you don't have that. That puts them at a disadvantage because now the coping strategies aren't employed, unlike generations of Black people. The racial socialization process is something that is passed down by generation and across our groups. So our cousins, our nephews, our uncles and aunts all share part of that. And those people who are part of a religious tradition, you hear it from the pulpit oftentimes. So in our organizations, you hear it. So you could be a member of the Divine Nine or something else, and you hear those coping strategies. And that unfortunately doesn't always happen among Asian Americans.
So, Dr. Smith, Dr. Hartlib, this has been amazing. I have one question from the audience that I'd like to insert here, and then we're going to transition and open it up for the larger panel discussion to continue this great conversation. So, a doctoral student at Prairie View A&M University, Tammy Lane, has asked this question. As a Black American, I'm trying to conceptualize racial battle fatigue in an HBCU environment. Can you comment on this?
I think Dr. Hartlib had a chapter in the book on that, right?
Yeah. So can you repeat the question?
Absolutely. As a Black American, I'm trying to conceptualize racial battle fatigue in an HBCU environment. Can you comment on this?
One, I encourage her to get the library to get a book, order a copy, so you know, then others can benefit from it. Racial battle fatigue, as I mentioned earlier, from my point of view, can be experienced in all different spaces. And so thinking about her work of a concept or a framework, you have a great Professor Bonner who's done, he's got this book coming out with different frameworks. So in terms of ideation, I mean, I think you're onto something. I think it makes a contribution. The intimate details, I don't know. I'd be glad to talk to that person via email or on the phone, but I think you're onto something.
Dr. Smith, do you have something to add?
Well, Carter G. Woodson said, a Negro educated at Harvard and comes back to the Black community could be just as dangerous as a white person teaching Negro children. So it's also a part of ideology. So a Black person with a majoritarian story and belief system can be very dangerous at an HBCU to other Black people. So we have to understand that that might be part of the package that people will deal with on HBCUs. And some HBCUs aren't really predominantly Black. I think Kentucky State might be predominantly white now. So we have to look at the changing environments and what's going on these campuses and what is the culture that is there. So when you see what I write about post-secondary education, I usually say historically white colleges and university. It matters less about the numbers It matters more about who's in control and what culture dominates that institution.
It made me think of the professor the white professor who's saying she was black and then just came out. So, you know, the ideology is 100%. That's super important. I would agree.
Thank you so much, Dr. Smith and Dr. Hartlib, for that engaging conversation. And I'm excited to open it up and get some more voices into the conversation as we continue to talk about the book and racial battle fatigue, triple pandemics, and just the situation that we have right now. So I'm going to open it up to our panelists for dialogue. So I'd like for each one to introduce themselves, respond in any way that you might want to the conversation that's happened thus far, and then share an experience that you've had with racial battle fatigue. And so I'm going to go in alpha order. I think I have these in alpha order. So Dr. Bonner, you go first, and then it'll be Dr. Curry, Dr. Ford, if she's able to join us, Dr. Freeze Britt, and then Dr. Howard Hamilton. And then Dr. Smith and Dr. Hartlib, after this, we'll start to get into a full conversation with everyone. Okay, so Dr. Bonner?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Smith. I am so excited to be participating in this conversation and using Dr. Hartlib's book and the great conversation that he and Dr. Smith just had just really serves as the boilerplate for a lot of the things that I thought about and things that I have done and trying to do by way of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also tackling this issue of racial battle fatigue from my own perspective. So one of the things I guess I want to say very quickly, I had a piece that came out in Diverse Issues on June 30th, and I titled it How and Where I Exit, which was a play on when and where I entered. And I presented what I call these 7 propositions. And these propositions were basically coming from my positionality as a professor in higher education, having worked in PWIs, and now being in the HBCU context. But the thing that I want to say that kind of goes back to the question that Dr. Hartlib just responded to is that many folks have a misnomer that they think just because we're in an HBCU environment or an HBCU context. But I think folks have to understand that although we're in the HBCU context, but the larger, we're a micro, but the macro is the larger US, the larger world global context that is, here at Prairie View is sitting in Waller County, which is very, very white, very, very rural. So I always say to folks, just because you're in an MSI, in a HBCU or a HSI or a women's college, you still are dealing with all those isms as soon as you step off the campus and even before you step off the campus, because we are in a larger context that forces us to deal with and grapple with issues of whiteness, white supremacy, and racism. So just because we're in this HBCU enclave here for however many hours out of the day, but our lives outside of this context and where Prairie View is ensconced, we still have to deal with systemic racism and being a person of color in a global context that doesn't always look favorably upon us. So just very, very quickly, one of the 7 propositions, I just want to touch upon just a few that I think are really, really key. The very first proposition, I always go to this one, and it's just kind of become like a Groundhog Day with me. I kind of circle back because I think quintessentially this is the greatest problem that we're having right now as people of color in the academy, is that our narrative has been stolen. We have got to reclaim dominion over our narrative. And I have said, and I say this again, is that it's not about, there are white scholars. I have some great friends who write on issues dealing with African Americans. I have Dr. Hartlib's book. Dr. Hartlib's book is the very first book in my Diverse Faculty Academy series. And he's Asian American, so we have LGBTQ. I mean, I think there are a lot of folks that can talk about the experiences from their positionalities, whether it's from a positionality coming outside of the Black diaspora, but I think it is very, very critical for Black folks to be able to talk about their own experiences as Black folks. And so often our narrative gets co-opted, and we are not allowed to tell our own stories, our own narratives. So I think we must take dominion over our own narratives. Another another proposition that I had was we need to look at multiple forms of activism. So often we think that there are folks, you know, if you're out on the lines, if you're protesting, if you're raising a fist, if you're doing the stuff that takes it to the street, that's the only way to show protest and the only way to be an activist. And I would say, you know, all of the scholars here, I mean, we're activists, we're doing it with our pens, we're doing it with our fingers on those keys. So we need to pay homage to the fact that there are multiple ways to show that you're an activist and multiple ways to participate in whatever movement it is, from Black Lives Matter to Me Too. There are different ways that we can do that. And one of the last things I want to say, given the controversies that we've seen with some time past with Dolezal and this very current issue with Krug, I say, you know, I am not surprised that these women were able to operationalize this farce in the higher education context, because higher education actually facilitates and serves as a incubator, I think, many times for folks giving performances outside of their own identities, because you're rewarded for a performance that very, very closely maps onto whiteness. Any performance outside of that, you're marginalized or seen as second tier. From our journals, from our presentations, for what's considered a impact factor, we know what impact means. It means impacting white folks about issues related to topics that are very, very near and dear and that are told in a particular way. So I think that as we look to really make a move, we have to look at, you know, what it truly means for us to gain our sense of authenticity and be able to tell our own narrative and to tell our own story. So for now, I'll stop right there.
Thank you. Dr. Curry?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, excellent. So my name is Tommy Curry. I'm a professor of philosophy and hold a personal chair in Africana philosophy and Black male studies at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. You know, my interaction with racial battle fatigue has really been formative, not only in the work that I do on Black men and boys, but also in trying to configure a mechanism to explain some of the biosocial processes that affect Black people, that make racism, or what I call democracies of death and dying, a public health crisis in the United States. The reality of the situation is that we're dealing with a political, economic, and social crisis that still puts Black people on the brink or in the constant state of dying prematurely compared to their white counterparts. And as we know with the research on weathering, aging earlier than most groups in the United States. The effect of this is really a syndemic crisis. And what I mean by that is that we see multiple social, political, and biological processes converging to actually exponentially multiply the impacts not only of depression and early onset of gerontological disease, but also the effects of pandemics. So you've created populations, because they're politically confined to depression, economic depravity, and political marginalization, that are not only more biologically susceptible to certain form of disease and illness, but also experience heightened forms of violence socially that impress upon them mentally and psychologically that there's no hope, that they can't live functioning qualities of life, and that their position within the United States specifically will always be disposable and not worth as much as white people. And these effects of dehumanization really do capture what I think racial battle fatigue points to in its biosocial and psychosocial orientation. Many of the works that come out today really focus on us kind of describing racism. We're pointing out the white races. But I think racial battle fatigue gives us an active mechanism to talk about the impacts and consequences that white supremacy and racism actually has on Black people. So it's so important as a paradigmatic intervention that forces Black scholars and other minority scholars to focus the attention on the oppressed rather than constantly appealing to the oppressor to get recognition or to solve their problem. It's trying to draw a particular kind of attention to how microaggressions, overt racism, segregation, and misandric aggression, which is one of my areas of research, actually impact the communities that are victims of that kind of violence in those dialogues. And to be honest, I don't think there are a lot of competitive concepts right now that allow racialized scholars to do that kind of work. Macro, micro racial formation theory is what, 20, 30 years old now. We're still dealing with concepts of white privilege that puts the onus back on white individuals and their recognition. Systemic racism actively describes system of oppression. But again, when focusing on us, the kinds of effects that we're mediating on a day-to-day basis, how this affects us not only biologically, but epigenetically, these are the kinds of conversations that really kind of marry the social and the outright violence of what Black people and other racialized minorities face in America at a ground level. Uh, my personal story is actually very similar to this. I had the unfortunate pleasure of being a full professor at an institution in Texas for quite some time. And before the censorship, and I think what we see today is the outright political suppression of radical racial scholarship that in many ways just outright violates freedom of speech as well as academic freedom. I was a victim of an onslaught by white supremacists. And to no one's surprise, the institution sided with the white supremacists because you had alt-right members on the board of trustees. Or, what was fascinating about that moment, it really does speak to how racial battle fatigue situates the relationship that Black people and minorities have to predominantly white institutions and just outright racism. Is that all of the issues of paranoia, psychological coping, dealing with the consequence of fears of death, right, are placed on a single individual. So everything about white supremacy and racism, microaggressions, political violence, threats of death, etc., converge on one person in one specific moment with the legitimacy of the institution. Now, regardless of how one interprets that moment or that event, the reality of the situation is you're confronted with death. So imagine, even if I'm not cognizant of it, imagine the kind of allostatic load being put upon me, right? Imagine how my telomeres are just not reproducing. I probably aged God knows how many years. But but those consequences, right, over a life course is really trying to be captured by all of those instances. So it's not just the experience, it's the outright political violence, right, that comes against Black people as a group and then targets the specific individual of the group itself. So membership in a racialized group puts you at risk, especially under an administration like Trump, right, for all sorts of mental and biosocial consequences. And I can't emphasize enough that without a way to capture that, without a way to understand that it's not us just describing political violence or social violence or censorship, but the ways in which all those kinds of repressions impact the body and impact the group, then we're fumbling around in vacuity. We have nothing to say besides describe, oh, this happened to us. What we have to start doing is really grounding how violence and oppression and racism and white supremacy impact the longevity of the groups of people that are targeted. This isn't about discrimination. We are well past the civil rights motif of we're being discriminated against. This is actual dehumanization. This is actual disposability. And this is, in many cases, if you were studying any other ethnic or racial group, this would be the beginning of group formations and genocide. So we really have to be careful about what's happening to our people and be very aware that the kinds of signs that we see right now that racial battle fatigue is illuminating speak to larger systemic problems and overall a demographic level impact to what's happening, you know, to Black people in the United States.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. Dr. Freeze-Britt?
So, wow. I know the audience is ready to dive right in here. Let me just say, so first of all, my name is Sharon Freeze-Britt. I'm at the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm a professor of higher education. I want to also situate myself as someone who came into the professoriate about 20 some odd years ago, but started my career in administration. And as both of my colleagues were talking about, you know, Dr. Smith and Dr. Hartlett talking about racial battle fatigue, I was being very aware of, and particularly Dr. Smith, when you were saying it took time, when you think about Dr. Pierce's work, your work, but I was thinking, but we've been experiencing it the whole time, our entire career. So it may have taken time for the concept to sort of merge, but we've been living it. And even in the course of talking about it, I physiologically feel all the layers of it. But I also noted a couple of things before I say something about my own personal experiences. I come at this in my work for having centered and in my research, Black students, Black people, unapologetically, and paid a price for that in the sense of all the ways in which we've talked about it. I refused to have comparison groups of white kids and white students and white faculty. I didn't feel like I needed them to understand the privilege of studying us, but that was met with constant battles throughout my entire career. But as I was listening to you all talking about what racial battle fatigue really feels like, looks like, and how it shows up, I'm afraid Black people in particular wait too long to recognize the impact of racial battle fatigue. Like, I think we have weathered so much that if you really hear all of that, the psychological, the emotional, I can hear us saying, well, I'm doing okay in those categories. I guess I'm not really. So I was worried about the extent to which we carry a load and carry it over a period of time that is beyond. It's not just our telomeres and our physiological deterioration. Every aspect of our lives are deteriorated. So I was thinking about all of that when you all were talking about racial battle fatigue and the reality, the realness. But I also want to turn, and I think I heard it in Dr. Curry's comment, and I know I heard it earlier. For me right now, I'm not only concerned about what we do with it, but what we're doing with ourselves. Like, where are we putting our focus and our attention? So I have spent more energy lately talking about really what does it take for us to radically care enough about ourselves, not just in terms of just traditional radical self-care. I don't think we come anywhere close to that. And trying to, and I think Dr. Curry, you did say this, like, where are we putting the focus? Is it external on the oppressor or on ourselves? And I think it is high time for us to focus on us and the impact of this work and research for us in the long run, because it is a form of genocide that's happening. We're losing our people, we're losing ourselves. But I also think how we navigate these spaces in the academy have to change. And that's where I'll lead into my example. You know, I'm just going to say the example that was probably truly, I felt like was the most significant battle racially I had in my career. And the short of it is that I was trying to help. And this is when I was an associate professor. I was one of the only person of color at that time who had been tenured at the table. Maryland's demographics have shifted at the time. I've been there 35 years. And there were a group of young, actually white scholars who were untenured in a faculty meeting who really were disgruntled about the department, who wanted to share something but felt intimidated by the full professors. And I happened to speak up because they had come to me outside of the meeting. And long story short, I said, you know, there are people around the table who do want to share some things, but they don't feel confident to be able to do that without retaliation. That day later, unbeknownst to me, I was with my research team. I get a knock on the door and a professor came in my office and accused me of mine F-U-C-K-I-N-G. And I was so struck by the assault, I had to make a decision in seconds. And my decision, I knew I had to either say, you need to leave my office or do battle. I chose battle. I said, I'm gonna have to. So we had a knockdown, drag out argument that my colleagues heard when my door was closed. And I mean, I can't even tell you how intense it was. But here's how I knew how much it impacted me. For 3 weeks, I was physiologically knotted. I was intense. When I shared it with my parents, who I often would say something happened in the academy. My father, both of my parents have transitioned now. My father's a military man, 30 some odd years, weapons, chemical warfare. he's never said this in his life to me. He said, do I need to come up to the University of Maryland? And I couldn't believe the assault on my person. Like, I would never go in anyone's office to do that. So I share that because that also resulted in a racial investigation in the department as a result. The department got a whole lot of things spun off. I never spoke to the investigator. I said, I don't need to tell you all about the incident. You already know. So part of my issue in dealing with racial battle fatigue over the years, and that I would say is a critical incident for me that I worked my way through, is that I've often said to people, we have to be able to do battle in the academy as Black scholars. Like, it's hard to exist in the academy without the unwillingness to fight your battles, which is why in those seconds, I chose not to excuse her, but to deal with her. So I think this is a topic where there's but no question that we are constantly in a state of fatigue. Long before we got in this new season, I think we're in something that's, I don't know what, Dr. Smith, maybe you're working on a new term, because I think it's intensified in ways that's beyond just battle fatigue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Friesbrett, especially for sharing that experience with us. We appreciate that. Dr. Howard Hamilton?
Am I next or Dr. Hampton?
No, I think it's
Okay.
you. I'm sorry.
Okay, all right, that's cool. All righty, all right, thank you, Stella. And Fred, thank you for allowing us to have this conversation and to be together. I've got to say that this is so cathartic. Thank you. I needed my sisters and my brothers to be here today to talk and just share and to renew and to be empowered and to know that I'm not alone and I'm not crazy in this space. I appreciate the validation from everybody. My sister Friesbrett, yeah, that story you just told. I mean, I think that there is a scholar out there, some type of battle, literally. I got disconnected. I'm sorry. Am I back on?
You're back. You're
Okay.
back. Thank you.
I'm sorry. I'm not saying that to be dismissive of what Black men experience. I'm just saying that because I'm wondering, because they feel that they can do that with a Black woman because of our history, our role, our experiences with majority, with white people in particular, that we serve that subservient servitude role, the mammy role, all of our lives, and they can just come in and just tell us what to do. But anyway, you got me going down a rabbit hole, Sister Friesbrett. So let me just share a little bit. I thought that Nicholas and William, your comments were so compelling, and I think about racial battle fatigue now with, as you all have stated, with the multiple pandemics, the viral pandemic, the racial pandemic, the marches, the Breonna Taylor, and Black Lives Matter, and our role as intellectuals. I think I had to go to one of my quotes from James Baldwin. James Baldwin said that to be Black and intellectual in this society, and he said this some 50 some years ago, to be Black and intellectual in this society is to be in a constant state of schizophrenia. Mm-hmm. Baldwin, and that is where we are as Black scholars, because we think about this stuff all the time, all day, all night, and we mull over it and we write about it and we internalize it. And the writing piece of it helps us also to cathartic, but it's also very, very challenging for us, because we're writing for the masses to share with everyone what they feel and what we're feeling. I also want to just make a couple of more just brief statements. And I think about what we were all talking about when Nicholas was talking about being the model minority, and when we are all talking about expectations of us from the majority. Toni Morrison has this wonderful piece. They did this wonderful piece on her, a documentary on her before she passed away. And I think it's called Pieces. I can't remember. If
The
anybody
Pieces That I Am.
Yes, you gotta watch it,
It's
because
excellent.
she talks about the importance of not paying attention to the white gaze, Gaze, and to watch the white gaze. It's that white person on your shoulder, just looking, just watching what you're doing and watching what you're writing and telling you what you're supposed to write and what you can't write. And she said, you just gotta just knock that just knock that white gaze, knock it off your shoulder, and just keep moving forward and doing the good work that you're doing. It's hard to do, particularly when we are when our work is viewed by white scholars for our promotion and our tenure. But you got to keep being unapologetically Black and writing where you're coming from and what's meaningful for you. So my story, you asked me about racial battle fatigue. Oh boy. I said, okay, let me think. Okay. The most recent racial battle fatigue, most recently. So in my department, okay, by the way, I'm chair of the Department of Educational Leadership at Indiana State University, Mary Howard Hamilton. And so my most recent racial battle fatigue was when I became chair of this department. There's this corridor, a hallway, and my office sits in the middle, and then there's this long corridor. And so somehow, somewhere, my colleagues had this great idea some years ago to put up the pictures of all the individuals who had been faculty in our department. Our department is close to 60 years old. And it started with, K-12, is just they're unapologetically white. And so K-12, there's all these pictures of white male, white male, white male. It just kept going. And I'm talking about going back, back into the 60s and 70s. And there was all these pictures. And then finally, after rows and rows and rows of pictures, finally in 2002, there's Candace Hinton, the first Black person, first Black woman. Then there's white, and then there's me. And then, so I said, okay, enough, it's coming down. All of this coming off the wall, all of it. I did not ask. I did not bring it up for vote. I said, it's coming down. We're taking it down. I can't take it anymore. Here's what I'm feeling when I walk into my office, when I walk in, and it feels like their eyes are just following me back. I'm like, done. And so had it all taken down, and they were, of course, upset about this. And I said, I said, do you understand the history here? And do you understand what you're saying to individuals who walk into the suite about who does and who doesn't belong, and who are the scholars here? And then I finally had to tell them, I said, actually, the straw that broke the camel's back was when my grad assistant brought her 6-year-old niece. My grad assistant is an African-American woman, brought her 6-year-old niece into the suite. She walked in, looked at the wall, 6 years old, and she said, who are all these white men? And so my grad assistant, and then she said, I thought you told me that your supervisor was Black. And she said, she is. And she said, these are the people who taught her. And she said, I don't know. She said, this doesn't make me feel good. And so that was the straw that broke the camel's back. Racial battle fatigue could start at 6 years old because she wasn't feeling good about what she saw. You know what I mean? So that's the most recent racial battle fatigue. I had to fight that. And it popped up on my evals, on my chair. It popped up subtly, Mary, she doesn't, decisions need to be made in a more collaborative, like, you know, whatever. That's it for me. Okay.
That is powerful, and such one. Thank you for your strength and your courage for doing that. And two, I am proud, but I'm also sad that that's the latest. That every day you walk in there and you have to be prepared. But thank you for your example. So we have some prepared questions, but what I'd like to do, we're getting questions from the audience. I'd like to just kind of intermingle those if everyone is okay with that. So the first one is Jonathan McCoy asks, how does one voice the pressure of fatigue but not suffer a backlash? Or is it unrealistic to not expect or accept that fact? So this is for anyone that might want to respond to that. So I'll repeat the question. How does one voice the pressure of fatigue but not suffer a backlash? Or is it unrealistic to expect or accept accept that fact? Does anyone want to grab that one? We call on somebody? Dr. Smith, what do you think?
Dr. Curry is about to.
Oh, was he? I missed him. I can't see him. I'm sorry. Dr. Curry, go ahead.
I was happy to yield, William. To be honest with you, I think at this point, backlash is to be expected. I think we've moved past the niceties of white liberalism. I think white guilt has exhausted itself in a moment where ethno-nationalism is truly showing its face and demanding a political platform. So I think that any expression of racial battle fatigue or criticism of a white supremacist system are going to yield very public and very vocal defenders of that system. I think under Trump, and especially within the Trump effect runs throughout American universities and colleges, right? Because now white supremacy is a political and intellectual position that can be maintained within academic institutions. It doesn't have to hide behind the veneer of science or conservatism. The effect of that is that people will now feel that it's okay to either tell Black people just to shut up and be quiet, or to assert that the very basis of the failure that Black people suffer from are from their own doing. And I think that that's just a reality that we're going to have to start preparing both graduate and undergraduate Black students to confront, because this is going to have to be met with direct criticism, challenge, if not social activism and protest.
I will add one thing to that, and the fact that you have to prepare a strategy for the backlash is contributing to your racial battle fatigue. So that's one thing. And then to go back to Dr. Friese-Britt, I think what that next level of recognition is the fact that we're dealing with genocide. The fact that Black people are hyper-policed, over-arrested, put in, not treated well with medical care. All of these type of things are occurring right in front of our face. And as Dr. Curry talks about death and dying, it's being accepted that right now in Utah, you have anti-mask wearers talking about, I have a George Floyd argument, right? So, that's madness. But the fact that, how do you feel to be hated from the highest office. All right. So that's one thing. And now, as Dr. Curry kind of alluded to, there's a Trump effect over in Europe. So the fact is, people are praising him and thinking that he's an angel sent to deal with one, the virus, but also two, with the uprise of social justice. So this process of genocide, this is what a lot of people have reported. Dr. Curry studied the Jewish Holocaust. And so he knows there's a corollary there. And I want to go back to Dr. Howard Hamilton. I won't share the story that she shared with me. It was when we get together, you know, Candace, Sister Mary, you know, the Deltas of the Qs, we like to huddle up. And so, but as she talked about, it starts early on, and she shared a story with me, and I had to co-sign with it. It goes all the way back to our elementary school years when there's somebody there who attacks us, a teacher. And oftentimes it's these Beckys that we don't really focus on that have interceded and caused us harm, mental and physical harm, that so much so in my study, national study on Black women and racial battle fatigue, one has a PhD who wanted to be a mathematician. And to this day, because she's not, she always considers like what would have happened had I continued on with math, but this white teacher told me Black kids don't do that, right? And then since James Baldwin was invoked, let me read this. He said this was in, I think, 1970, but James Baldwin said, "I will flatly say that the bulk of this country's white population impresses me and has so impressed me for a very long time as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long." So there are white folks who need some racial awareness training, and I'm talking about some serious, that they need to become social justice activists, but they don't realize they got a problem. They've been white too long. And so that's the reason why they don't understand when we just say Black Lives Matter. That's all. It just matters. We didn't say that it's better than everybody else. We say it matters. And there's a problem with mattering. That's a problem.
Can I weigh in on something very quickly? It kind of goes if I understood one aspect of what the participant was asking, and this may not be a strategy that could work, but I think one thing we have to turn this whole notion of, if I'm going to voice my fatigue, I would be careful who you choose to voice it to. Everybody doesn't care about our fatigue. So I would be thinking about, who am I about to talk to about this? Who's going to be affirming and understand and help me strategize? So that's number one. And number two, I would say, more so than voicing who you're going to voice your fatigue to, make a decision about what needs to be edited and change your behavior without telling anybody anything. In other words, once you say, here's what I need to feel to begin, like if my workload, if different things, and that may not be a strategy that some of you may say, I can't do that. I would argue that if we turn our attention more to what's on our plate, what we're doing, and I'm going to say this because a colleague of mine, Patricia Hill Collins, and I were on campus on these different committees and meetings, and we were leaving a meeting and someone had stopped us and they asked me to do something. And I said, yeah, I can do that. I said it in like 5 seconds. And Patricia looked at me and said, you answered that real quick and just added that to your plate. What are you going to take off? What are you going? And sometimes we're not checking our behavior and and we're trying to help too many folks. And she literally said to me, and it's not like I don't know this, but she said, always say, I'll get back to you. And never say yes, even if you think you're going to say yes right away. And I just thought that was a powerful reminder before we get so tired and fatigued. And that's not all racial battle fatigue. Racial battle fatigue is a different thing. What I'm saying is I think on top of the racial battle fatigue and what we sign up for, we're exhausted. And so that would be part of what I would add to that.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question? No? We've got a couple of other questions, but I'm going to pivot for a second, and then I'm going to get back to questions from the audience. So I have been wondering, this is my question, and I'm putting it in here because I want to get it answered. I have been wondering about gender and racial battle fatigue, and how they're related in terms of the work and the scholarship that we have seen in the scholarship that's been done. Can anyone comment about the gendered aspect of racial battle fatigue?
Can I share a kind of something that happened recently? I'm in the field. Folks have on the panel have indicated their fields. I'm in teacher education and ed studies. And part of ed studies is to prepare teachers who go out and teach, but then also to prepare just more curriculum theorists who go on to grad school. And I was on a group, I'm on a board for the state. And I think there's two other males on the board. So mostly women, I would say mostly white women. And I made an offhand comment. I said, you know, I need to leave the meeting early because I need to attend my daughter's softball game, and it's important that I'm there. So my family's important. And I said, you know, and I made an offhand comment of the girls in my community, they get less fields than the boys do, and they're less quality. And person said, you know, I have this book here, and she talks about this book about how, you know, mansplaining and all of this. And so I guess my contribution to this conversation is I started to think about, you know, in this space that was mostly female, cisgendered, heterosexual white women, how I come into this space and I experience it through a racial lens, but then also from my heterosexual, heteronormative perspective, view it. And I'm very aware of, you know, I don't want to mansplain. I want to be empathetic. But then I started to think, well, my field is very dominant by white women. And, you know, some of the things they say, it's just like, did you just say that? And so I guess my contribution is that's something that I've been pondering a lot. And I don't know if there's people on the panel or people tuning in that are aware of scholars that have written about this kind of space. But it's something that's been on my mind quite a long time.
Thank you, Dr. Hartlib. Do others want to chime in on that question?
I'm not in the, just to add, I'm not in the body of scholarship around that, and haven't been. I've been in STEM work for engineers and physicists the last couple of years, and now moving into some other mentoring kind of stuff. So just when you asked it from a scholarship standpoint, I would be fall short of an ability to talk about who's doing that intersection. So I'm hoping a couple of my other colleagues might know.
Dr. Smith, Dr. Curry?
Yeah, most of my research, or a lot of my research, studies white women, unfortunately, but they present themselves as problems that have to be constantly encountered. I mean, there are a few different ways that we have to think about this. One, we have to look at the specific power dynamics that white women exert in various situations and circumstances. There's a fundamental delineation between what we think of as racism and the ideas that define sexism, be it misogyny or paternalism. The reality of the situation is that throughout various studies, and I'm thinking about the ambivalent sexism scale here, Flick, Fisk, and Glick's work, you see high levels of paternalism with white women. So even when you have sexist attitudes and a patriarchal culture, that white patriarchal culture is not trying to exterminate white women, right? In many ways, it actually depends on them, incentivizes them, it builds up certain kinds of behaviors that want to be part of the system. That is not the case for outgroup men and women, specifically outgroup men. Outgroup men usually act as triggers to white women's paternalism, meaning that if a white woman feels that she's threatened usually that ignites paternalistic violence from white men against the out-group male group. So we see this in immigration, we see this in police brutality, we see this even on in the street when they do random studies of whether or not white women feel threatened and the people that come to their rescue. I think we are most familiar with this in terms of white women's tears, right? So if a white woman in a white space feels that she's threatened or unhappy, white men rush to offer her comfort, usually to the cost of minority people there. The reason that this is important in terms of racial battle fatigue is that it sets up the conditions by which racialized minorities are always exhausted in their confrontation with other people who occupy the minority status. So that means that white women are taking up a kind of discursive political and cultural capital in institutions and in society where they get to proclaim that they're in fact oppressed, but in practically every measure, life expectancy, education, social mobility, etc., they surpass practically every other racial minority group. So that means that certain kind of resources, forms of violence that we endure that they don't endure, they nonetheless get to claim part of that experience, right? And in fact, operate to actually demonize us. So I think that racial battle fatigue actually has a very close connection to how we think of gender. William A. Smith's work, of course, with misandric microaggressions and even introducing the term of Black misandry operates to add and really condition how different forms of, embodiedness, right, sexual stereotypes, et cetera, lead to more aggressive forms of depression, anxiety, and just the way people experience different forms of racial aggression.
Thank you, Dr. Curry. Did anyone else want to chime in on that question?
I was just wondering, William, has there been a body of research on racial battle fatigue and its impact on minoritized women? I haven't seen any articles, but I'm sure that you might know of some.
Yeah, there are a good number actually. Some don't come right out and have racial battle fatigue in the title. They might mention it as part of either theoretical framework or some part of the design, the methods. Um, but it's all about a biopsychosocial model. So, for instance, there is a study that looked at 59,000 Black women and their experiences with daily racism and institutionalized racism. And those Black women who encountered more daily racism had lower subjective cognitive functioning than those who didn't. Memory loss, early onset, this, oh gosh, my memory's going.
Dementia, early onset dementia,
Dementia and Alzheimer's.
uh-huh.
And so those women, same women who reported having 3 of the 5 domains of institutionalized racism had, and actually in the first one with the daily racism, were 3 times more likely to have lower subjective cognitive functioning. And those Black women who experience institutionalized racism almost had the same thing, about 3 times more likely than those women who did not report experiencing institutionalized racism in at least 3 to 5 categories. So what that means is that Black women who experience daily racism or institutionalized racism oftentimes are misdiagnosed with early onset dementia or Alzheimer as some non-race related condition, when it's really the institution of racism, white supremacy, that's causing early onset dementia or Alzheimer. And while I'm at it, the same thing can, when we talked about the overall depression, Black people who witness an unarmed Black person get killed by the police report for the next 3 months lowered mental health days. So one killing of an unarmed Black person leads to at least 3 months of reported lower personal mental health days. An additional killing adds another additional 3 months. What this means, said another way, is that if you look at racial battle fatigue contagion, that's about 55 million personal mental health days, negative mental health days that Black people in the US will experience. That's, if you correlate that with diabetes, Black people have about 77 million poor mental health days related to diabetes. That study went on to say that they feel like they undercounted the effect of racism in killing. Same thing in another study talks about Black people who get stopped by the police, and they called it post-traumatic stress disorder, but we don't live in a post-racist society. So we can't have post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a misnomer. I don't know where to go besides Wakanda where there isn't anti-Black racism. So what happens is when we're stopped by the police, that triggers racial battle fatigue among that group, not just the individuals like with the Black women. It can spread out. So it's interrelated. So I'm saying this, that there are many studies that complement racial battle fatigue. So as I defined it, those studies would work. And I also define Black misandry and anti-Black misandry and anti-Black misogyny as both systemic and ideological justifications toward the aversion, oppression, subordination, violence, silencing, controlling, hyper-policing, and the justified killings of Black boys and men, that's anti-Black misandry, i.e. George Floyd, and Black girls and women, anti-Black misogyny, i.e. Sandra Bland.
The first, William, the first research piece you cited with the Black women and racial battle fatigue, would you happen to know who that author is on that one? I'm just curious. I'd like to see that.
I can either email it to you, or I could put it in the chat when somebody else is talking.
Okay, then. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Dr. Bonner, did you want to get in here?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we have one of the things that, as I look at racial battle fatigue and the way that we approach it, and the way we talk about it, and I cautiously use the word, because I think we use, abuse, and misuse the word, the term, the concept intersectionality. So I'm going to say, instead of different intersections, I'm going to say different permutations. I think we have to look at what racial battle fatigue means for different populations in different contexts. And I'm always a stickler on looking at context. You know, when we carry context through to its logical end, we're looking at people, places, and situations. So as we're looking at racial battle fatigue, we really have to consider context fully. So who are the people? Is it Black women? Is it Black men? Is it Hispanic women? Is it Asian men? So who are the people, and what are the places? As we're talking about this experience is in higher education. Dr. Smith mentions, he had a really great quote where he said, we're dealing with these Plessy institutions
Plessy
in
like
a post-Brown environment. And
Mhm.
so as we're looking at context, you know, and considering racial battle fatigue, who are the people, and what are the places that they're dealing with, and then what is the particular situation that they're dealing with their racial battle fatigue. So you have to consider context. I think another really important thing is that how do we translate what we learn from racial battle fatigue to policy? So many times we talk about issues from the perspective of what is the outcome, and how do we make these policy implications and policy changes? So often with my students, particularly those in dissertation phase, I tell them, you know, you have spent 100, 200, 300 pages talking about all these problems, all these attendant issues, and you get to the very, very end, but you don't offer any policy considerations, because the only way we're going to start to affect change is to be able to operationalize what does racial battle fatigue mean in real and cogent terms, and how does that translate into some policies that we can actually implement to affect change. And one of the last things I want to say is, I think what racial battle fatigue does is that one of the latest publications that we're working on right now is termed Square Pegs or Round Holes. alternative student affairs development frameworks. And the reason that we define this particular volume is that going through a higher ed administration, Dr. Mira can attest to this, higher ed and student affairs, we're taught to look to the higher ed can talk about this too. So we got Chickering and Riser, we got Perry, you know, we have Tinto, we have Aston, Pasquarella, Terenzini. So we kind of go on and on and on, so much so that we just spit them out. But my thing has always been, how do we divine frameworks that are more apt to fit the experiences of people of color, instead of trying to shoehorn everybody into these frameworks to say that, you know, you're Black, brown, you're Asian, you're Hispanic, you have to fit into Chickering's model. You have to fit into Astor's model. What about using something like the Nguzo Saba to talk about Black racial identity? Or what about using racial battle fatigue to talk about how students intersect and how they connect with institutions to better explain how their experiences in real and authentic ways? Because I think so many times we miss the authenticity because we're trying to shoehorn everybody into these frameworks that don't fit from the first place. We have size 8 shoes and we got a size 12 situation that we're dealing with. So how do we find ways to better fit? And I think the work that Dr. Curry's doing, the work that Dr. Smith is doing, they're giving us these frameworks. It's left up to us to use them. But then that goes back to the very first thing that I said earlier, that we have to grab our own narrative. We have to have dominion over our narrative. So we have to start directing people to these scholars. One of my good colleagues here at Prairie View, I call him the Godfather, Dr. Parker. He's a former dean. He's been here for, I think 25, 30 years. He's been here for a while. So we all look to him. And he says, you know, Bonner, it's something I learned from you when you first came here that I say to all folks that are completing their dissertations when I'm in the defense. You must quote a scholar of color. So my thing is, how are you going to talk about all these issues that are impacting our community and you never cite William Smith? You never cite Tommy Curry. You never cite Sharon Fries-Britt. You never cite Nicholas Hartlett. You never cite Mary Howard Hamilton. I don't understand that. So on my watch, you know, you can do what you do, but for me to be on your committee, this is what we got to do. This is how we got to frame this, because we have got to give ourselves the voice, the dominion over our voices, and that starts with the research. And the very last thing I want to say is, as scholars, and all my colleagues on here know this, we always talk about theory to practice, but we have to do that last piece, theory to practice to theory, because these theories are not going to be informed unless we have the initial theory, but we go through the practices and what we learn from people of color, what we learn from these experiences that our colleagues so poignantly shared about going through racial battle fatigue. So now you got a real experience. You can't overlook that. So now you've had that practice, you've had that practical experience, and use that praxis to go back to inform theory to say, okay, now we have a better vantage point to say exactly this is how this is experienced. I'll stop there.
Fantastic, Dr. Bonner. And we got a comment that Dr. Parker's been here for 45 years. So he's really, really our sage, really our sage here on campus. And your comments actually lead to another question from the audience. Tamara Stevenson asked, how might I go about strengthening the connection between racial battle fatigue as experienced by participants in these campus policies and practices? So when you're looking at faculty recruitment and retention, promotion and tenure, disciplinary actions, course evaluations, how do we make sure that those processes are, how do we change those processes in order to support examining, making sure that they take, that they aren't triggers for racial battle fatigue? How do we make them more equitable?
Yeah. I'd love to just make one comment about that, and it relates. This relates to the importance of having minoritized faculty who are department chairs, deans, and associate deans. Particularly, I've learned as of late, and this is going to get into a piece of research I'm delving into now, which is African American women who are department chairs and who aren't. I mean, we're if I truly believe there are few of us, and I truly believe that if there were more, particularly Black women, minoritized people who are department chairs, we would have more African American and minoritized faculty who make it through the tenure and promotion pipeline, take down all the pictures on the walls, create the spaces that are good mentoring. Good mentoring opportunities for young faculty to move through the ranks. So that's part of it. And so what I've done here is I've encouraged my colleagues to look at ways where we can create training opportunities, looking at opportunities to become, succession planning. Think about who's out there and how we can get more underrepresented individuals to become leaders, academic leaders on campus. That will help. So that's the policy part of it. All of us have got to get in there and encourage institutions to find more academic leaders to push for more policy changes and more minoritized faculty.
I want to sort of co-sign on what my dear friend just said there, because in my 35 years being at Maryland, it's only been in the last 5 or 6 years in which I've had 2 chairs of color, non-African American actually, but it made a difference. And I had never experienced the buffering, the layer between me and a whole lot of crazy folk. And some of it never got to me. I didn't feel, and I used to use the term with the first person who was the chair, that it was the first time I psychologically felt like I didn't have to come into the campus worrying what's going to happen today, what's going on, because I felt like I had a layer where I would, things didn't make it all the way to us. So that's one thing. I think leadership does matter, and having, and I don't think it's just folks' skin color. I think there has to be a degree of consciousness and willingness to do the battle that makes that happen. So you can't just have folks of color in those roles. You have to have people who are conscientious, who are going to do the work, who are going to address it. But I also think that can happen even outside of those formal positions. So for example, as we built up more of a critical mass in our program, we have a predominantly in our HESI department, folks of color department. And that took strategic work to make that happen. We all do that. Like we sort of shut it down quick. Like, so when nonsense starts coming up, we're like, we have enough of us to say, to question that or to counter that narrative. Or to ask people, well, wait a minute, there's no reason for you to have to go down that, whatever the road is that creates, as the question was asking, the kind of trigger points, to call those out and to address them and to absorb that hit for candidates who are coming behind us, who are trying to climb that line. So I think not just in leadership, but in shaping the professoriate with more folks of color who have a diverse set of experiences, who are willing to speak up. And again, I say, it's not enough just that people are diverse. They have to have the willingness to do the battle and to call it out.
And one, I would agree with Dr. Hamilton, her comments. I want to put an exclamation point on that. That's so vital. My fear is that the literature, as Dr. Bonner has said, if we're not reflective on our ideas, we just go with what's shiny. So people are saying, oh, well, we'll just cluster hire, that'll solve it. And we're like, that's not going to solve, that might be part of it. But if you hire folks of color, indigenous scholars, women scholars, minority scholars, and it's a toxic environment, are you going to retain them? You know, are you going to promote them? Are you going to have them in leadership positions? And so one thing that, you know, the Tamara Stevenson, her question, to me, I'm thinking about, you know, a plan might be theoretical. This is the plan. We're going to target a certain number of, to see a benchmark if we're going to hire in diverse. And that's great. It's great that you're doing that and you have that idea, but it's, what are the assumptions in that? You know, will you retain your faculty? I mean, in the beginning of the book, I share a story at a minority serving institution. We talked about, folks have mentioned about we're intersectional beings. We live in contexts that ever change. You know, I might have been employed by a minority serving institution, but when I looked, I didn't see very many folks of color in leadership positions, and the union was very racist. And so when you pour into that research, you can see, yeah, you're in a progressive state and a minority serving institution, but you're experiencing institutionalized racism at the hands of the faculty union, you know, who makes you, well, you have to read the book for the narrative, but makes you really wonder, you don't want to come into work. And so that depersonalization, that's a mental security. I'm going to avoid campus. I don't need to, I'll just go to the library. I'll get, so you avoid people. That's not like that's not a good environment to be in, where you feel like you're a member of that department or the community. Until we arrive at that you can come as you are, we have a lot of work to do.
Thank you, Dr. Hartlib. Anyone else want to chime in on that? So I have another question, and I think it's from Sandan Long. And the question is it because we compare ourselves to what we think people think we're supposed to be? And what I'm thinking, and I'm adding this and trying to provide context for the question, I'm wondering if they're asking about why we experience racial battle fatigue, like how it's brought on. Dr. Smith, would you like to take a stab at that?
So how is racial battle fatigue brought on?
So they were asking, so the question that they asked, I'm sorry, the question just went away, hold on. The question that they asked was, is it because we compare ourselves to what we think people think we're supposed to be? And so what I'm adding to that is I think they're trying to better understand why we experience racial battle fatigue. So I think they're trying to figure out how the context for that.
Maybe somebody is, but that's not been the source of the data that I've looked at.
Okay.
I think that we're just trying to be human. What people want is the security, love, caring, food, water, and a sense of belonging. And when those things are jeopardized, and when your total humanity, I mean, look at it this way. 61% of our history in the United States, or what has become the United States, was under a system of Black enslavement. After that was a period of Jim Crow for about 3% of US history. After that that was the Black codes, I'm sorry. Jim Crow was about 13% of our US history, all the way up until about 1969. So really still oppression, segregation, economic exploitation. And then if you read Michelle Alexander's work, we're in the new Jim Crow era, and I extended all the way to 2020. So that's 100% from 1619 to 2020. 100% of our history has been under racial domination. Who can handle that? Mm-hmm. We're just trying to live. We're trying to survive. We don't even cause, and we're entitled to, I believe, the self-defense that measures what we endure. Now, Tommy got in trouble for that just by saying what was historically accurate about what Nat Turner or people like that would do. But white people can't bring on self protection of their family if it harms white people. All I'm suggesting, I'm not even talking about violence or self-protection or anything like that. All I'm saying is the right to be human. We don't care about other people. The right to be human. When that's questioned and jeopardized, there was a study, and I'll be quick. It's a classic study on basically gender and who holds brilliance, right? Classic study that's been done since the 60s. And always, no matter if you look at adult population or young people, men hold more brilliance than women. That's a self-assessment. This study said, well, we want to complicate that. We want to look at who holds brilliance among a racially mixed group of participants. And we want to look at white women, white men, black women, black men. What all, and these were actually elementary school students. All of them agreed. Black girls, black boys, white girls, Asian boys, Latinas, Latinos. White men have the most brilliance. But there was a time, they weren't prepared for this. White women and black women hold the next level of brilliance. The least brilliant were black men. Now, the study fell apart because they didn't know how to deal with Tommy Curry's work, Fred Bonner's work, Donna Ford's work, right? So they was like, well, they made apologies to other people and didn't focus on black boys. That might have helped us understand the school to prison pipeline. That might have helped us understand school climate. That might have helped us understand low teacher expectation. That might have helped us understand classroom environment. But they don't have a lens to understand the pain and suffering of black boys. So that's why I agree with Dr. Bonner. You have to separate these groups. It's a problem to call them Latinx. It's a problem to call them Asian Americans. It's a problem to call all these groups one thing and treat them like they are the same. Among American might be experiencing something totally different from a Korean American. And a Korean American might be experiencing something totally different from a Japanese American. And Chinese Americans might have a heightened level of racial battle fatigue because this president is a racist. And we can never understand the magnitude of racial oppression when we keep clustering people together that don't belong together in a racist type of data collection. So what we have to do, we have to be prepared to start to not have business as usual, to disaggregate data, look at these groups and the pain and suffering that they are experiencing. So now when those black boys have a 5th grade failure syndrome and go to penitentiary instead of where Dr. Howard Hamilton can touch them and say, you are brilliant, right? Or Dr. Freeze Britt touch them. And so what I did in my class, I said, I want you to walk around campus and find the black men, young black men who not athletes, couldn't do it. Mm. They're not in our departments. They're not among our faculty, but nobody seems to miss them because we have an expectation that they either supposed to be on the street hustling, in jail, robbing somebody, or some antisocial behavior. But they're not supposed to be here. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem that we're facing in higher education, that some people try to play oppression sweepstakes. There's a lot of oppression to go around. We ain't got to one up anybody. Our source is to get white supremacy off our back. And if I kill anti-LGBTQ sentiment, that's going to help black people. If I kill anti-Chinese American sentiment, that's going to help black people. Our correlation is higher for every other group. If you have something that you hold negative against one other oppressed group, you hold a higher antipathy towards black people. So it behooves us to be social justice, advocates.
It was powerful. We're coming close to our end time. I have our final question, but did anyone want to chime in on this one before we transition?
Dr. Smith took it to a deeper level towards the end, but I wanted to say something about how you gave us the periodization of racism over all these phases. And the reason why I wanted to go back to that is the comment I made earlier about, do you have a new term for we're in something different now, but what it is the sedimentation of racial battle fatigue, the layers it's created in our psyche and our physical. That's what I was thinking about when you were just giving the historical period at which things shifted and are continuing to shift, but all the way through the thread is we've been under attack for racism. And so it is the sedimentation of the weight of it. When you said, how much can we take? it's why it feels particularly ominous and heavy right now. And literally in another webinar, I was making the comment about higher education context taking our breath away. Like we don't even have the space to breathe sometimes. So I just wanted to make that comment. That's what I was thinking about on the front end of your comment in particular.
Thank you. That's powerful. The sedimentation of racial battle fatigue. I'd write that down. Because that's very, very powerful statement.
It's just layers, layer upon layer.
Mm-hmm.
And it forms hard, unbreathable sediment. It's hard to function.
Exactly. Wow, it's powerful. So as we transition, several questions have asked for advice or coping strategies as you're working through and experiencing racial battle fatigue. And I'd like for each panelist to respond to this question. This is kind of our closing question. I wanted to end with advice or some kind of hope, which is why I'd saved this question for the end. We will go in order. Well, no, we'll just let people jump in. So whomever wants to start first.
Repeat the question again, please.
So it is, what advice or coping strategies would you give to persons experiencing racial battle fatigue?
I would say if you're experiencing racial battle fatigue, don't be gaslit. You are experiencing it. Nothing's wrong with you. To find a community of people you trust and you can confide in and share your experiences with without fear of that they'll use that against you. So finding community and a sense of belonging. Find mentors who have been where you are. So if you're young, find someone who's a little older, who's experienced that. You can learn from their experiences and wisdom. Self-care, as someone said earlier, take care of yourself. It's not being selfish. It's a marathon. So particularly if you're experiencing racial battle fatigue in the academy. And lastly would be to be good to yourself and patient with yourself, because sometimes I think you are gaslit. You have to take a double take. Like, did I just experience that? And you need somebody to run it by. Is that normal? Like, no, that's not okay. All right, and then you have your sanity back. And so, and what other things, or exercise, or other things that you can take care of, prayer, whatever you need for your overall wellness and well-being. That's my suggestion for coping.
Yeah, I'll go. I've got to say that I love what my colleague, Dr. Fries-Britt, said earlier, to be unapologetically who you are. That helps. So if you were going to say that, Sharon, I'm sorry, I stole your thunder.
All right, no, I'm attacked. I want you.
Be unapologetically who you are. Be unapologetically Black. That helps. That helps a little bit to have that shelter of, that bubble around you about the racial battle fatigue. Because if you feel strong and confident about Blackness and who you are, and for me, ditto everything Nicholas said. Biblically, no weapon, find your scripture, no weapon formed against you. Just pray, read your Bible, do what you got to do, but spiritually stay grounded and stay unapologetically who you are. That's all.
I'm a tag team with my colleagues, because I know our two big think tanks up here on critical race and battle fatigue will take us to another level. So let me jump in real quick to say, you are absolutely right. I think we have to be true to who we are. I am a warrior spirit. So over my career, when I got sick of this, I even though I said earlier, go to the people because people may not care, I did not believe in taking it home. I was like, okay, y'all gonna throw it. I got two hands, I'm gonna catch one and the other one to throw it back at you. So my spirit is a little bit of a warrior spirit. So I gave people stuff back. So I believe in the truth telling. I paid a price. Now, mind you, I paid a price, but I added up those. I said, okay, if I got fewer no's than yeses, I can still get over that hump. I wasn't going to let that be my placating people, because you got to care about who you are at the end of the day. I've seen too many people lose who they are. And so for me, part of taking care of myself is I'm not going to just catch your mess. I'm throwing it back at you. So that's my survival. That's number one. You have to decide as if that works for your personality and for your style. In the long run, for me, I am happy about who I am today, because I don't got to grin at none of those folks. I'm still at the same institution. So we all know who threw stuff at each other, and they had to catch mine and I caught theirs. And I would rather I can stay healthy and be who I am and not owe you nothing, because we dealt with it in real time. And Mary, back to your comment about, because you were breaking up earlier when I gave my example of what happened to me. Part of it was control when that colleague came, and it was a white woman who came in my office and thought they had the right to use certain kind of words. So self-care for me, that's why I said I had 3 seconds. I either can escort you out or we're going to do battle. I'm a warrior. We're going to do battle. So you know never to come in my office again and think you have the right to speak these words to me. But because she opened up the space, I was able to throw some stuff back at her. So that's a big part for me of taking care. But you got to do it within your style. And I know how to be diplomatic. I know how to be, but when you take it to that level where you're now attacking my person, then I have the right to protect myself. I would add on what Nicholas said, everybody else said. I believe in prayer. I have a lot of spiritual time. And the longer you're in this game, you just decide to shut it down. We don't have, every file does not have your name on it. You ain't got to open that file. There's enough work for us to do. So there are times we have to back up and take our power internal and be quieter in our spirit so we can take care of ourselves. Everybody doesn't have to know what's going on all the time, because that's a power we can maintain. So all of that, I think, is a big part of how we stay healthy in the process.
I just kind of reflect on my grandmother, Colleen Northcutt. She used to say all the time, if you come in pieces, you might not depart whole. So I think it's very, very important.
Write that down.
I think it's very, very important to kind of reify what my colleague said, is to really seek this sense of wholeness. And my major word is always about authenticity. So who are you? Because you can't do battle unless you know who you are. I mean, are you a soldier? Are you equipped with the stuff? And you really have to spend that time doing some soul searching and finding out authentically who you are and what you need to be okay. You know, is it the spiritual awareness? Is it connected? Is it reading your Bible? Is it walking around the park? Is it spending time with your dog, spending time with your family? But what are those things that make you whole? Those are going to be the things that really are going to sustain you as you deal with racial battle fatigue, because all my colleagues here, you know, we've gone through the battle, we fought the battle. But the one thing that we can say coming out of this is that who we were going into the battle are the same people who we are coming out of the battle. Now, we might have been scarred, but we weren't killed. But if you have a better sense of who you are and what you are and whose you are, I think that really brings a real true sense of fighting this battle and being equipped to do it.
Yeah, I think that's a loaded question, because I just left the United States, so it's, I think an exodus is certainly an option to dealing with racism, white supremacy, and white people. You know, because I think it's a question of how you understand your specific situation. Being that I was in Texas and that I was actually arguing that Black people had a right to defend themselves rather than simply lay down and be slaughtered, death threats and the political repression of the state, you know, made leaving the United States an option. I think that there's a long history, especially of Black militant thinkers, as well as Black men who have left the United States precisely for this reason. On the flip side of that, there's a real question of whether or not we think that we can cope given the environment that we're in. Because I really do believe that Black men and women are put in a position now where we can struggle, we can have our belief systems, we can cope through the kinds of suffering and repression that we endure. But that comes at the expense of knowing that at any point, a white person could take our lives with impunity. That at any point, we could be the next Black person on the news, despite our social position. So I think that we have to circumscribe our optimism with the reality that we are in many real ways confronting death. And that's what we're risking because we don't know what shooter, we don't know what colleague, we don't know what police officer is going to have a bad day and make an example of. And for me, it was that kind of contingency, right? Being in a place like College Station, being in a state like Texas, where there was just increasing tensions and rhetoric around Black people, around critical race theory, around Black radicalism, leaving the United States was the best option. But if that is not your circumstance, I think that we have to find a way to both resist and try to get some notion of security and safety in the communities and the institutions that we're actually working.
So I'll say this first. I agree with what all of my colleagues have shared. And I want to echo something that Dr. Curry said. In my national study on Black women and racial battle fatigue, and I'm still analyzing the data, about 1/3 of those Black women said that they are ready to leave the United States. Of that 1/3, about 2/3 of them had Black husbands and Black sons. And that was one of the reasons why they said they felt the need to leave the United States because it was so dangerous, and that the racial battle fatigue that they were facing, in addition to their own, was to think about their husband or sons not coming home alive. So I want to just echo that with what Dr. Curry said. Now, in racial battle fatigue literature, and as a framework, there is resiliency. So we do have resiliency within racial battle fatigue, and some of the things that people have mentioned are part of that. But what I also end with, particularly in the racial crisis in American higher education that'll be coming out in my chapter, is trauma-informed care applied to racial battle fatigue. So with that, we have to realize the systemic individual nature of racism, how it causes racial battle fatigue, and seeks resilient adaptive coping strategies. We also have to recognize the signs and symptoms of racial battle fatigue in oneself, in our family, and our group members, which means because of racial battle fatigue contagion, we have to treat it like a pandemic. So we have to kind of put on a mask. If we're dealing with heightened levels of racial battle fatigue, we can't bring that home and infect our children or our partners. So we have to be very careful in how we're coping and being resilient, that we don't increase our loved ones' racial battle fatigue. The next thing is how we respond. And so we have to respond by fully committing to strength-based, asset-based coping strategies that are based in healthy racial identity development, right? Healthy racial identity development. The next part of that is resist. So I've said realize, recognize, respond, and resist. We have to resist the individual, institutional, and systemic efforts at racial re-traumatization. And how we do that is through protective, proactive, and adapting coping strategies. Part of those are, well, part of the protective racial socialization process is racism awareness teaching. And we've done that across generations and intergenerationally. So we have to do that. But the main component that I've found in the research, not just the research I've done, is a healthy racial identity development can help mediate racial battle fatigue. You can't eliminate it because, as Derek Bell said, racism is endemic, right? Patriarchal domination is endemic. So we have to understand that. And if we understand that, we have to offset it by having an even higher ethnic racial identity. If we're questioning, one study said it was on Latinx folks, primarily Chicanos and Chicanos, all right? They said if they are in a period of racial exploration, they're at more risk. If they have a racial identity commitment, then they can offset, and this was a piece on racial battle fatigue, they can offset and mitigate racial battle fatigue. So we have to be committed. Black folks, we know that history. Other groups have to do much more research on the whole racial socialization process. But that is one of the things, the mitigation of racial battle fatigue is in a healthy racial identity. And then all of that, as Brother Bonner said, comes with the Nguzo Saba, comes in with economic self-reliance, political support, Black Wall Street. So, and maybe develop a Wakanda, and let's all go home.
Dr. Smith, what can you put in the chat, or for everyone that's tuning in, what is that book or that piece that you're referring to, or the book?
It's my chapter in the book.
Okay.
And
that's out, or it's coming out?
It's in press right now.
It's in press. Okay, I wanna read that for sure.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's see, I might have it. Yeah.
So thank you so much. I don't know if we could have ended this session any better. So Dr. William Smith, Dr. Nicholas Hartlib, Dr. Fred Bonner, Dr. Mary Howard Hamilton, Dr. Tommy Curry, and Dr. Sharon Fries-Britt. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective and information on racial battle fatigue with us today. It was my honor and pleasure to serve as your moderator. So I'm going to transition. Yeah.
Can I just say one thing before you?
Yeah, I was transitioning to you. Yes.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to thank all the colleagues, my brilliant colleagues, but beyond them being my colleagues, they're all my friends, and I really appreciate and love them all. Thank you for participating. But I do want to send a special shout out to the man of the hour, Dr. Hartlib, and his book. Be sure to pick up a copy. I gotta hold it up, Doc. If you can see it. Racial Battle Fatigue in Faculty. And really excited about this volume. The narratives, all of them are autoethnography and really, really powerful stories that that Dr. Hartlib has curated in this book. And make sure you pick it up. But the second thing that I want to say, the second volume, Dr. Hartlib has the distinction of being the very first. And we just commissioned the second volume for this series is Dr. Sharon Fries-Britt. And she has a powerful book coming out on Black women in mentoring in higher education. So we're on to a very, very good start with the series. And I appreciate you all for tuning in.
Absolutely. Along with my colleague, Bridget Turner-Kelly. So
yes, Dr. Bridget Turner-Kelly. Yeah, I can't forget Dr. Bridget. Absolutely.
Great. Looking forward to great chapters coming in.
So thank you, everyone. We're going to send out an evaluation, and in that evaluation, we'll have a link to Dr. Hartlib's and Dr. Ball's book, as well as additional information about resources that have been shared during the event. Any final comments, Dr. Bonner, or any panelists?
Just that you did a fabulous job, Dr. Stella Smith. So thank you so much. You did a fabulous job.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
We couldn't make it without Dr. Smith.
That's right.
She's our anchor.
Thank you so much. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and have a wonderful evening.